I'm not sure who is sharing right now.
I'm sharing, Noelle, so just
Okay.
let me know what slide you want to start with.
Oh, okay. I'll just start with this slide. So, hi everyone. I'm Noelle. I'm from the University of Minnesota Systems Thinking Work Group. And since August, I guess, can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So far, our experience with learning how to use systems thinking in our own problem sets, we started with identifying cause and effect relationships in news articles that were given to us, and then creating loops based on what we found from those news articles. And then we had discussions and critiques of, so each of us came up with our own general problems, and we discussed and critiqued everyone else's, looking at the biases that we had, like making sure that we are investigating the problem rather than trying to find solutions for them. And then we discussed effective communication strategies, finding a balance between advocacy and inquiry, which is just asking questions or like stating your own ideas and opinions and trying to figure out which situation would be best to either advocate or like ask questions. And then with choosing our variables, I think we've all tried to use like neutral language to try to describe that. And then addressing mental models that we may have while presenting our stories. This is kind of related to checking our biases. And this was useful when we did our discussions and critiques. Using the ladder of inference, which is when, like how we think about like a situation, or like the process of thinking about a situation or a problem, where we take what we have or like our data and then select and interpret whatever we find is relevant to our problem, and then making conclusions and how that affects our beliefs and how we and our actions and how we go about the problem. And then one thing that we noticed was that how we tell our stories or like explain problems depends on who we are talking to, and like what we know about them and what we think they know about the problem that we are discussing. So yeah.
All right, I guess this is my slide to talk about. I'm Brigitte Lazinski. I'm also from the University of Minnesota group. And I think we all kind of added something that we're excited to keep working on it within our group moving forward. So between our individual problems that we're kind of working on, as well as our large group problem that we're working on, I think we're all pretty excited to and looking forward to making and applying a system dynamics model in respect to just understanding the different, as Noelle mentioned, perspectives and how we can kind of all collaborate on that. For a couple of us, I would say probably Manny and Aaron probably know more about cover crops and their usage in Minnesota. And so I think that's another thing most of us are looking forward to, is learning more about that, and just an area that a couple of us maybe have never really delved into, I would say. So there's some learning curves and challenges there, but definitely a great thing for us to all work together on. As Noelle also said, we've kind of done some peer reviews of our individual problems within our meetings over the last couple of months. And I think that for me, that's been really helpful, and probably the rest of my group as well. We really like being able to get together and kind of go through things and get feedback so that we can make the best models and kind of better understand systems thinking as a whole. And then finally, learning how to approach problems or issues properly, and then identifying the pieces within those problems that can help us create the most optimal models. Again, going off of that perspectives key kind of, I think, is something that we're looking forward to. So I'm sure there's a lot more that we're looking forward to, but those are just a couple of the key things that we've kind of moved through in the last couple months.
So just very briefly, these are our problem sets. So for me, I am investigating why some residents are annoyed by odor from livestock facilities. And I'm trying to use the systems thinking approach to try to identify impactful drivers that lead to support or opposition of CAFO construction.
Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So my unique problem says looking how manure and cover crops can synergistically impact crop yield as well improve soil and environmental health, and kind of looking at how the systems dynamics can basically see there's actually a way we can balance these loops and create a, I guess in the far end, solution.
My problem continues to develop. I think most of you are probably familiar with that's what I was working on when we were actually in Texas. Trying to identify if there's aspects of communications that haven't been identified as part of the communication gaps during disease outbreaks for animals.
And then my project, along with Abby's, has also kind of changed a lot. Just every time I look at it, it gets changed a little bit more. So right now I'm kind of working on looking into why there's a lack of transparency within the swine industry, and from producers to consumers, and maybe a little bit on the impact that has on consumer trust. So looking at how we can maybe get around those things in the industry and be more, as producers can be more transparent with consumers to kind of maybe increase the trust that consumers have with us.
So unlike everybody else, we kind of didn't make any loops. We kind of created the backstory for our loop that will probably be done in the next couple weeks or so. So I guess I can just read off the paragraph so you guys don't have to read it. So our story is looking at manure and cover crop. So we want to see how we know that manure can be a beneficial form of fertilizer for crop growth due to its nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrient content. However, due to increased weather anomalies in the upper Midwest, manure application tends to be applied prior to the optimal time frame due to wet conditions in the spring, not allowing for machinery to access the fields. As a result of the mistiming of manure application, there is an increased risk of nutrient loss when applied following the harvest of row crops and prior to row crop planting. The loss of nutrients from agricultural fields has a realized effect of nutrient loads in waterways such as major rivers, lakes, and coastal regions like the Gulf of Mexico. Cover crops have shown to reduce nutrient leaching, predominantly nitrate, which can range from 99 to 95% in effectiveness, which was assessed in a meta-analysis review. However, cover crops have shown to reduce row crop yield in certain regions due to reduced soil moisture content, while a study in Michigan reported a no yield reduction from the presence of cereal rye. Cover crop adoption has been modestly rising over the years throughout the US. However, in Minnesota, the rise is not as realized. The slower rates of cover crop adoption can stem from several reasons, of which include uncertainty of cover crops' effect on yield, as well as determining the most appropriate strategy to enhance cover crop growth to gain the full benefits of cover crops to agroecosystems. So from this, we basically pinpointed some key variables, weather anomalies. As we experienced in last year, our springs have been getting wetter and wetter, so that's actually reduced our ability to plant our row crops in the spring and at a early enough time. So with that, since we are applying manure early in this year, usually in the fall after row crop harvest, that manure that got applied in the field is staying out longer before any row crop can be utilized. So there's actually a increased risk of nutrient loss that can enter into the waterways. So another key variable is manure application fall versus spring. and also manure nutrient loss. And so a way to look at a different system is using cover crops. So instead of allowing the field to be fallow in the fall to spring, right before row crop planting, we can plant a cover crop, and hopefully that cover crop can take up any nutrients out of the soil system instead of it being leached or run off into waterways. And hopefully we can look at to see if cover crops can impact row crop productivity, and maybe we can look at how cover crop adoption can change over time, especially in the upper Midwest like Minnesota.
So through this story, we've been able to identify some key relationships that we can likely build some loops from and apply some archetypes. And the first of those is the use of cover crops synergistically with row crop production and how that specifically looks in Minnesota. And the timing of manure application according to post-harvest, pre-harvest, working alongside some of those weather abnormalities, and then how that can affect the nutrient loading in our local waterways, which then ultimately affects the Gulf of Mexico. And lastly, a relationship that we've discovered is the use of cover crops and how that might change nutrient loading in the waterways, because there could be less potentially loading in the waterways because of those cover crops used.
So we've, as a group, we have been spending a lot of time talking about our individual areas and some of the underlying problems, focusing on really why we are looking at looking at our different research areas that we are looking at. Why are we still looking at these areas? Focusing on the problem. And I guess I've been pushing my group to focus in on a fairly specific scope, including a region or a timeline of the problem, just to make sure that, especially for their more individualized problems, that they're biting off something that they can chew. And then looking at how these key variables have changed over time. What I'm excited for is to learn from all of you and practice as part of our group how to define and look at these mental models and how to incorporate them into these diagrams, because I think underlying a lot of the problems that are both our manure cover crop story and then the other ones as well, there's a lot of mental models under there. And I think it's a little daunting to sometimes put those those mental models in words for fear of offending someone perhaps or offending groups. But I think that is a nice, it's going to help our group move forward with some of these, looking at some of these problems, particularly when it comes into the adoption piece, for example, with the cover crops and with the biosecurity and the odor, and then also the consumer producer relationships. I think putting these mental models in place is an exciting avenue that we have yet to go down, but we've learned a lot from all of you just today in that aspect. That's all that we have.
All right, thank you guys. So from the group, any questions or feedback on presentation, the questions you were seeing?
Just, I mean, this isn't like a huge question or anything, but just so I think I understood, but so y'all decided to do this one, like follow through this one main question and then also have y'all's own individual questions? Is that what I think I understood?
Yeah, for practice, we've been focusing in on having everyone define their own, focus on their own problem as well. But as a group, just for purposes of these types of meetings moving forward, we'd have one example.
Okay. That's what I thought was how y'all did it. And I think that's pretty, I mean, it's unique in y'all's own aspect. I think that's actually really neat that y'all looked at everybody's individual questions as well.
We can see a lot of overlap, I think, especially once we start getting into these mental models, that overlap will become even more apparent.
Right. It's interesting. And it'll be really interesting to see at the end when we all present. Are y'all going to be presenting like just this one, like the very end of this fellowship, or will y'all be presenting each individual one and the main one? Have y'all decided?
We have not decided.
Well, that's no problem. Y'all got time.
Let's see how much energy or how much gas we have in the tank. But
Yeah, I can imagine.
sorry, I'll let the group speak. I'll let out.
I just want to say that that's a fantastic topic. I love the idea of that you're covering a manure application in crop growth. This is more from a personal standpoint. My family is from the farm. They are farmers, small scale farmers. But yeah, I've had a lot of discussion with people telling them, you don't always need to dump a whole bunch of manure on your land every single day of every week. You know, that doesn't quite do the job. But yeah, there were definitely some bias there, understanding as to what the manure actually contributes to soil and when it doesn't contribute anything. This is cool. It's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question. As far as, have y'all decided y'all gonna do a local area or regional, like you know, the whole U.S. How this can apply, or because or does it vary between regions? Let's say here in South Texas we get little rain, it may affect a cover crop production, or versus manure, like the burning the plants, being on there without water or something. I mean, does that play an effect into all this? If it's regional, or if it's across the U.S. an issue that's across the U.S. or just is it a regional product? I mean, issue that helps in y'all's region. I don't know if you understand that.
Manny, go ahead. You can answer.
Yeah.
You guys hear me well? Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we're gonna focus more on like the region, kind of more the upper Midwest, since manure application is very is widely used here. Cover crops aren't as much as well as yet, but I mean, like, we can't really focus on Texas. You guys have a lot of cattle, a lot of livestock production. Cover crops are very hard to use in Texas because studies have shown that they reduce row crop yield as the paper, the Lewis Burke citation I used in this one. That's actually a Texas citation that they actually showed decrease in yield because of cover crops. They compete for water and nutrients. So whereas like in the Southeast and maybe up here in the upper Midwest, they're more easy to use because there's ample rainfall, but still, especially in the upper Midwest, cover crops are not as used as much because there's a very short time window to use them. Whereas like in the Southeast, you have a longer time window, so you can have ample biomass production right before you terminate.
Yeah. So it does vary from region to region, and so it's going to be more of the local area, or the Midwest.
Yeah.
Well, and as a reminder, geographically, Minnesota has the headwaters of the Mississippi River. Yeah. And we and Iowa are blamed for, I forgot what that's called, the black wall in the Gulf of Mexico.
Oh, the algae bloom. Yeah, the algae bloom in the waters of.
Yeah, so where basically the ocean dies, and so most blame that on Minnesota and Iowa because of our intense fertilization and our intense cropping systems.
Yeah.
So it's a huge topic for us to be protecting our waterways and our I can't think of the name now, but anyway.
Yes, I understand.
Yep.
I have I guess I'll ask it as a question. I don't know if you've gone that far yet, but I'm just wondering whether you are looking at the system sort of with cover crop being a policy scenario that you test. What happens if they don't use manure and use cover crop only, or are you looking at different grades of agricultural management? I'm just trying in my head to visualize what the loop will potentially be like.
I guess the main focus
It's
is,
okay if you're not that far yet. That's fine.
well, the way I see it is like manure is going to be applied no matter what, because that's the main source of nutrients for row crop production. But since manure is applied predominantly in the fall, because farmers can get into the field in the spring, there's a huge risk of nutrient loss after the thaw events. So we're trying to see if cover crops can kind of create a balancing loop with nutrient loss.
Okay. Is that the only, I guess, ag management scenario you're going to test within your loop structure, or you're looking at other alternatives?
I don't know the answer. I need help.
I think for now we're focusing on what has been used so far when it comes to the adoption, the adoption of these cover crops. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Hearing none, let's give these guys a round of applause. So overall, great presentations. Really, I'll speak on behalf of the mentors, and they can feel free to support or dispute me. But we've seen you guys working so hard on these things, and giving extra time above and beyond your classes to get to this point. We're all at various stages in our development, and that's okay. Hopefully by the end we'll, we might still kind of stagger a little bit in our development, and that's okay. But I can see myself that you guys are getting these concepts down. You're really trying to apply what you've learned between the lectureship back in August, what you've learned with your local mentor, the materials that we've provided you to work on, ladder of inference, all those things. And so kudos to everybody there. Aaron, Ben, did you want to add anything? We'll get to Ben's presentation.
Sure. I'll just add that what I encouraged my guys to do is, in doing the exercise of getting down into the structure, is one, you need a clearly defined problem. So if you're still wrestling with what that is, it helps to get down knowing you're at the right structure by forming that focusing question around a really tight problem that is pretty clear. And then just to take the second group for an example, because they kind of sketched out on the PowerPoint their PowerPoint loops. And so what I encourage, not just this group of students that you saw present, but any of my students that work on this, is when you build that structure, and you've got maybe 8 or 10 variables up there on your screen or on your paper or whatever, is ask yourself and that was part of the discussion, what do you mean by the regulatory variable, and what do you mean by the conservation versus regulation, all that whole discussion. Is ask yourself, what do you mean by that variable, and what dynamics are you trying to explain by that variable? Because oftentimes you will read that variable, and when you explain it to somebody else, you force yourself to explain, what do I mean by this link? You will actually discover that you're not talking about that variable, you're talking about like 4 or 5 variables. And so what I tell these guys to do is you got to unpack that variable name, and what are the 4 or 5 variables that's part of that story that you've just sort of collapsed into, regulatory compliance, or, I'm not picking on that group because we all do it, but by that variable, what do you really mean? Do you really mean that as some problems on the landscape go up, that compliance goes up? Or do you really mean that as problems on the landscape go up, there's reaction by stakeholders that go up, and so there's renewed effort to update and enforce the policies. And then through that renewed effort, there's actually greater compliance down the chain. So it's the same story, but you added two variables in between to help flesh out the story, which is why somebody mentioned earlier, I can't, to these guys, I can't see your variable names. Well, probably on the computer screen you couldn't, but on a projector you probably could. But the problem was that you got so much going on there. That's because these guys were forced to sort of unpack the variables and explain. They're laughing now over here because for about 3 or 4 weeks I said, you haven't unpacked anything. You got to unpack it and put something down to explain what's really going on. So that, besides number one, clearly defined problem, and then number two, to get down into the structure of what's there, sketch out your 8 or 10 variable names that you're starting with. Okay, fantastic. But then unpack those things to really get at what you're really trying to mean.
Great, thanks, Ben. Erin, anything to add?
Not at this point, no.
All right. So definitely in all 3 groups, we're seeing mental models come through. And I know that my group, I had a conversation with them and I shared that with the other mentors when we do our biweekly calls. But it's something that I think all groups struggle with, is the idea that we sometimes have these variables to which we don't have hard data, which is difficult for scientists to kind of wrap our heads around, right? We love data, we want data. But when we have a mental model at play, we may not have hard data. And there may be other variables that maybe aren't mental models, maybe that are about the other parts of the structure that don't have hard data. And so this is where we're going to have Ben take over and kind of talk a little bit about some of those issues and concerns, because they're really not issues or concerns, I think.